Video games. The world's greatest playground. The only place on Earth to see the full absurdity of the human mind. There's so much more here than we could ever imagine. Video games were invented in 1946 by one Jimothy T. Video Games with the Tetromino box. It was an instant success, except that it killed almost everyone who tried playing it. Fast forward 73 years or so, and you'll find that we have even less understanding of what video games are, what they do, or who they're for. And yet, they have become exponentially more complex with each new title. Platformers, first-person shooters, puzzle fighters, 3D shooter roguelikes, rhythm and dance, whatever the fuck this is. Video games are complicated. I hope to start pinning them down, if only a bit, in the length of this video. Let's try to simplify things by classifying the pieces of video games. We can start with the largest umbrellas, the physical and the virtual. Physical components include anything in the real world that affect the video game. Your DualShock 4, your TV, even you. Virtual components are the elements which contribute to the player's experience, and that includes mechanics, sounds, and colors. When these two components come together, the result is an engaging experience that is fun for the whole family. To some, it might seem as though the terms hardware and software could be better labels for these components, but this disregards non-electric elements which contribute to gameplay. The terms physical and virtual are chosen to be broader and thereby more inclusive of the pieces of the system that we don't normally consider when discussing video games. Now let's get more specific. These two groupings are useful in differentiating between the meat space and the meta space, but it's the building blocks of each which will give us a better understanding of what, specifically, is being used to create video game experiences. For the sake of illustrating the physical components, imagine someone playing a NES on an old TV. The material pieces of a gaming system, and therefore the video game which you are playing, are all there. You have an audiovisual system, a console, a controller, and a player. The audiovisual system is the tiny, undoubtedly hand-me-down black and white television. The console is that odd gray, red, and black box, the Nintendo Entertainment System. That other gray, red, and black box in your hand is the controller, and of course, that someone is the player. Let's start with the audiovisual system. That old black and white TV is what allows the player to perceive the pictures and sound. Of course, audio and visual aren't always projected from the same device. Headphones can provide a personal audio experience, or a projector can give a larger picture on any surface. Changing the audiovisual system will change the player's experience, and in some cases it will change the gameplay. For example, the PlayStation 3 was released with high-definition capabilities, but many people were still transitioning from a standard-definition television. Playing a game running at 1080p or even 720i on a standard-definition TV could cause small details to get lost, including UI elements. As another example, consider The Elder Scrolls: Skyrim. This game is available on PlayStation 3 and 4, Xbox 360 and Xbox One, PC, Nintendo Switch, virtual reality systems for personal computer and PlayStation, Amazon Alexa, and even refrigerators. The gameplay is nearly identical in most of these versions, yet the experience is much different in each, and this is largely due to the change in presentation. The console, which is the NES in our demonstrative example, is any hardware used to run the game. This could be a computer, a Sega Genesis, or even a tablet. The specific components of the hardware must only be complex enough to process the code which runs the game. What this means is that, in some cases, the hardware is relatively interchangeable to the gameplay experience. However, publishers who wish to port or adapt a game to multiple platforms will have to make adjustments so the game can function. For example, the game Zombie U was built specifically with the Wii U gamepad in mind, so the player could reference their inventory or map at any time on the second screen. When Zombie was released for other platforms, most of which have no access to a second screen, the components that were persistently available on the Wii U's second screen needed to be moved to a standalone menu in-game. The controller, that brick-like contraption in the player's hands, is what provides input from the player to the console. Without this device, it would be impossible for the player and the game to interact in any meaningful way. Almost anything can be made into a controller, but the most common configuration is an ergonomic plastic case containing a joystick or crosspad for movement, a series of easily accessible buttons used to access game functionality, and a few auxiliary buttons to access menus for game settings or console functionality. Then there is, of course, the player. The player is perhaps the most dynamic part of the system, since they have the most effect on the game, and the game has the most effect on its player. The player participates in the game by providing input via the controller. Controller input is processed to manipulate a main player character, a cursor, or some other entity within the game. Meanwhile, the game is directing, and in some cases directly manipulating, the player to perform in a way that fits within the confines of a video game engine. In other words, the player uses the controller to affect the game, and the game uses a number of techniques to affect the player to make them a more consistent agent. Of course, the specifics of this example aren't particularly relevant. The controller could be a Wii U gamepad, the audiovisual system could be a 50-inch flat screen, and the player could be your cousin's dog. As long as all of the parts work together to affect the game's state as we'd expect them to, then you have a video game system. In fact, some of the most interesting gaming experiences can be found when folks think creatively about the elements of this system. Here are a few examples. For controllers, Rock Band and Guitar Hero gave players the ability to play with controllers shaped like instruments. The Wiimote asked players to move around the room in order to play games. Nintendo Labo gives players the ability to construct their own accessories for use within specific games. For the console, the Super Game Boy allowed players to play their Game Boy games on the big screen. The Steam Link allows players to stream controller-friendly PC games to their TV. Google and Apple are offering gaming services where players don't even need to own the console on which it's being played. Concerning players, Twitch Plays Pokemon was a crowdsourced playthrough of the Pokemon games, and Dark Souls and Journey offer online play without players interacting directly. Let us now discuss the virtual elements of a video game. Here, for the purposes of illustration, we can consider Maniac Mansion, a point-and-click adventure where a group of archetypal teenagers try to rescue their friend's girlfriend from a deranged scientist being mind-controlled by a meteor. You cannot make these things up. First, the gameplay. This is the system used to engage in play. It includes mechanics, actions which the player can perform or interact with, and rule sets, limitations imposed by the video game's code. In Maniac Mansion, this would include the list of verbs at the bottom of the screen, the cursor which allows you to click on certain objects on screen, and the character who carries out each action. The rule set for Maniac Mansion would include things like, if an Edison family member catches you, you die. Or, you can only click on quest-relevant items. Next, the narrative. This is not only story, but environment, characters, and even music choices. There are many elements that come together to develop the narrative. Even elements like mechanics or the heads-up display system can affect the narrative. Ultimately, narrative encompasses the elements which help the player understand and process what is happening in the game, why it is happening, and how it is happening. Looking at Maniac Mansion, Dave's raison d'etre is to save his girlfriend Sandy. We aren't sure if anything but friendship drives his friends to help, but their character design tells us how each character can help. The family in the house, the Edisons, and the mansion itself tell us more about who the inhabitants are, what they do, their intelligence levels, and so on. The environmental storytelling, the character depictions, and the sound design all contribute to the narrative. This is not to say that any of this is necessary for a game to be good. Individual video games exist on a spectrum as to how much narrative is included. Games like Pong or Joust are probably closest to a zero-narrative game, or games that have almost no intentional narrative elements. Games like Gone Home or Skyrim would be considered high-narrative games, or games which have an extensive amount of narrative. Perception describes the sensory elements of the game. These are the elements of a video game which affect how the game feels. This includes visual elements like a character's depiction, audio elements such as soundtrack or sound design, or even tactile feedback such as rumble effects included with modern game controllers. These are all ways in which the video game is engaging with the player. Concerning our example, Maniac Mansion uses very little music in a way that calls back to many horror films of old. The characters are drawn with large heads and slender bodies, so the characters look a bit awkward, a detail that adds to the game's tendencies toward the absurd. Last but not least, we have user experience. This includes things like the settings menu, difficulty levels, and accessibility options. Essentially, user experience describes the elements of a game which support or hinder a player's play experience. In the case of Maniac Mansion, user experience was pretty bleak. It was difficult to tell which objects a player could interact with. The verbs listed at the bottom of the screen were numerous and vague. Players had to choose a verb before they could interact with any object. While these issues are likely due to hardware limitation, they still limit the audience who can play the game. Again, the virtual components discussed earlier can come in abnormally high or low amounts. For example, the mountain simulation, Mountain, contains very little interactivity after the first set of questions. Gameplay still exists, but is so limited that a player could do other things while playing. Meanwhile, Grand Theft Auto V provides so many gameplay options that it can be overwhelming, and a player might not even do all of the things possible in the game. Pong has nearly no narrative projected by the game, though one may be constructed by the player anyway. On the other hand, Telltale Games releases like The Walking Dead, or interactive fiction games like Valhalla, can lean so heavily on story that the game's focus is primarily on narrative. Gameplay functions can even be stripped back sometimes, so the player can focus more of their mental bandwidth on the story. The lack of sensory input in the unfinished Swan, at least in the early game, provide a unique solution to wayfinding, as well as a strange introduction to the game's mechanics. Meanwhile, Batman Arkham Asylum provide players with a wide variety of visual indicators and modes so the player can better develop a strategy for attack. Metal Gear Solid V provides an experience mostly free from a user interface, and players can even turn off mechanics that were meant to assist a player in tough combat situations. Functionality like reflex mode. Meanwhile, Persona 5 provides such a strong user interface, or UI, it can seem intrusive to some. However, the aesthetics of the UI fit perfectly with the rest of the game and provide more cohesion to the game's overall feel. You might ask how classifying the pieces of a video game can be helpful. Video games are complicated. They often employ people from a wide variety of specialties, including user experience design, composition, 3D modeling, sound design, and even architecture. By labeling the pieces of a video game, it becomes easier to see where individuals might contribute to a game. But more than that, it gives us a meaningful language to explain how a particular video game works the way it does. A game might feel problematic, but without a specific aspect of the game to reference, it can be tough to communicate the problem you might have. It might even be difficult to determine what problem you might have. It also gives designers a chance to experiment with particular parts of the game. By seeing the pieces laid out like this, designers can have more access to the conceptual idea of a video game and better understand what they can and cannot change. I will not claim that this is the only way or the best way to dissect a video game or to classify its pieces. This is only the way that works for me. It is specific enough to be useful, but not so specific that I find it burdensome or confusing. Video game design can seem like a lofty, complicated process, and for a long time it was, because access to the resources necessary for video game design were limited. However, with the growing availability of video game design technology, more people can make games. I wanted to spend time making the concept of video game design more accessible. And if I'm admitting a bit of selfishness, now I don't have to explain what I mean when I discuss these parts. You might not agree with my definition, but at least there is a point of reference. Video games. Let us all make them. I only need half my wits to be a match for you. I had dreamt enough for one small life, and of such follies, love, justice, friendship, glory, as well as dream of being tall. Your grace, if you take my tongue, you will leave me no way at all to pleasure this sweet wife you gave me.